I'm curious your thoughts now that we've heard from Vladimir Putin again today, exactly what his station inside the Kremlin is, the weaknesses that may have been exposed, knowing that no one was coming to his defense for a number of hours there as Mr. Prigozhin made his way to Moscow.
Yeah, look, it's clearly been a very tumultuous and surprising 24, 48 hours. Who would think we'd ever see something like this happen? But it did. And I think today what we see is Putin trying to shore up his support. We talked a little bit earlier about his basis of power, beginning with the oligarchs and then the security services and then the Russian army. And I think right now he's trying to make sure he can tamp them down and make sure they remain loyal to him, because nobody came out over the past 48 hours when Prigozhin was talking and moving to support Vladimir Putin. And that had to send a really chilling message to him, Putin, about his support within the country.
But Prigozhin has been quite critical for weeks and months, and no one was supporting him either or defending Putin. Putin was well aware that he was getting very frustrated with the support he was getting and how he was being ignored by Putin. Why did he wait for the last moment for this to come to this brink, Prigozhin 2 to 3 hours outside of central Moscow, to then decide to cut a deal?
Well, look, I think you are right. For months, he went on complaining publicly about Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, about their inadequate support for Wagner, whether it's ammunition or assistance or supporting infantry, you name it. He complained on and on. And look, none of these men like each other either. So there's that dynamic. Putin allowed that to go on. And I don't know why he tolerated that for so long, to have that type of internecine warfare going on in the middle of a fight. And I think it reached a point. I think we saw a little bit of this a few weeks ago. If you recall, when Wagner pulled back from Bakhmut after seizing it, he had a confrontation with an infantry brigade on the ground, charged with laying mines in his path. And then on Friday, he alleged that the Russian military struck his men. And I think that set him off. And so much so that he planned this march to demand Shoigu and Gerasimov meet with him. And then at some point along the way, he realized nobody else, at least in the Russian military, was standing up with him, and certainly not in the Kremlin either. And I think he had to quickly find an off-ramp, and that off-ramp became Belarus through Lukashenko.
Amazing. Secretary, bring us to Ukraine. To what extent is the Pentagon right now working with President Zelensky to take advantage of this situation?
Well, I think the best thing to be doing right now is, frankly, nothing. I don't think we're going to give the Russians, the Kremlin, Putin, any reason to say this is all engineered by the United States or the West or NATO. I also think you've got to be careful about doing something that unifies the Russian people around Putin at a time when he is on unstable footing. So I'd be very careful about the next moves. That said, clearly, the Ukrainian military is in this position, coiled back, ready to strike at some point, using the full weight of their 9 U.S.-trained and equipped brigades. But right now, it seems like this mixed result on the battlefield is still filling out the Russian front lines and trying to figure out the best place to attack and the best time. Again, I think the timing now is affected more so than maybe the place of attack.
When you look at the front lines, Wagner Group is obviously being dissolved. Putin this evening in Russia said that those soldiers could either go home to their families or join the Russian military. It leaves a question what happens with the leadership of the Russian military, like Shoigu, who showed his face today. Will they be fired? Will they be asked to step down?
You know, you would have thought that Putin would have made a change after the failed counteroffensive, if you were, in early December, when the Russians were supposedly on the move and then could not gain ground. And that's when it was handed off to Wagner Group to take Bakhmut. I would have thought there would have been changes there. I'm not so sure he can afford to take changes now, because it'll look like he is in some ways yielding to Prigozhin's claims. That said, I think, you know, there's what happens in Ukraine, but the dissolution of the Wagner Group, and we need to see if this actually happens. But if that occurs, it's going to have ramifications beyond Ukraine, because, of course, Wagner is instrumental in Syria, Libya, Mali, and other places in Africa where they are an extension of Russian foreign policy. So this is going to have an impact on those parts of the world as well, and what it means for Russian influence.
No one really knows where Prigozhin is right now, Mr. Secretary. I spoke earlier today with former U.S. diplomat Brett Bruen on Bloomberg Radio, who referred to him as a marked man, suggesting he may not be on this earth a lot longer. What do you think?
Yeah, if I were him, I'd stay away from high-rise buildings and other areas where the FSB can get to him. He's a billionaire. He has the means to kind of go find refuge somewhere. Who knows? But I do agree that he's a marked man. Putin cannot afford to have him or others who, and maybe it's senior Wagner commanders, for example, others who are out there who are willing to move against him. So I think over time, you will see these players taken off the battlefield in one way, shape, or form.
If Prigozhin is properly pushed to the side, which they're saying potentially he's in Belarus, if you believe that, but what happens to the work he's done for Putin in places like Africa, which is very important to the Kremlin to try to make inroads?
Yeah, well, that was my earlier point. I mean, Prigozhin was a charismatic leader, and it's hard to see who can replace him. Plus, again, does Putin want Wagner out there in organized units that are capable of returning to Russia at some point? I don't think he does. But who knows? Maybe he finds a way to transform them. But if not, if he has to dissolve Wagner, then again, that's going to have an impact on his influence in Africa and the Middle East and other places. And as you know, Prigozhin made and Wagner made a good deal of its wealth off of these places where they would provide security services in exchange for mineral resources, for other types of payments. So, look, it's one big racket. It's like a big gang, if you will, mafia. And so it'll be curious to see how this all plays out in the coming weeks.